I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. Bill, here's a word you don't hear very often, or a couple of words: U.S. Steel. When's the last time you heard that in the news? Well, it's in the news now because the United Steelworkers and U.S. Steel have come to a tentative agreement that calls for the first pay raise in a long time for workers at U.S. Steel. And they're crediting this not only to President Trump's tariffs, but to the booming economy. This is big news when it comes to, a sector that has been so hard hit, American manufacturing. Bill, is this something that President Trump should be crowing about, or should we be careful because those tariffs are going to come back to bite him when costs go up and therefore everything we buy gets more expensive?
Well, let's deal with the tariffs briefly first, and we'll talk about the much more important issue about U.S. Steel. It's funny how much of the world is coming back to the same question about ethics and the question of, is this situational ethics? And I keep coming back to the same response. You have to fight the fight that the enemy brings you. If you come in with an honorable fight, which is what we do, then we fight honorably and rationally and reasonably, and we argue and we come to an agreement, and that's great. But when you're getting shivved in the back, you have to adapt your tactics. And that's how I feel about tariffs at the moment. I'm dead set against tariffs. I think tariffs are a bad idea. I think they've been shown historically to be a bad idea. But when you're getting rolled by China, for example, for as long as we've been rolled and as passively as we've allowed it to get on, the way I look at the tariffs in this particular case is it's a punch in the nose to gain somebody's attention and perhaps regain a little respect. And what happens downstream, I do not know, but I know I wasn't very happy with the way things were going before. Now, to the much, much, much bigger issue, much, much bigger issue. It's not about U.S. Steel, and it's not about price negotiations, although they are a small part of this. What Donald Trump promised to do and what he's done, and which Barack Obama and everybody else for that matter said was just impossible, was bring manufacturing jobs back to America. I've maintained for a long time that while we certainly cannot compete with Asia's cheap labor cost, if we could just start going out there and doing a little drilling, we could certainly out-compete them in our energy costs, which is part of the price of making a widget. So what I see happening across the board and what I think other people are seeing and what I think doesn't scare the Democrats enough, so God's sakes, don't tell anybody about this, would you? But what seems to be happening is, and we've been doing a very good job of that so far. What seems to be happening is that the entire Democratic, it's not just the base, it's the soul of the Democratic Party is moving away from the Democratic Party, and they're moving towards Donald Trump and the Republicans. When you can be a lifelong Democrat and a hardworking Democrat, and we know many millions of these people, maybe not personally, but we know they're out there. And there are many millions and millions of Democrats in the armed services and so on and so forth and so on. So when I talk about Democrats, I'm usually talking about the progressives and the Marxists that have taken over the Democratic Party. But what seems to be happening on a large scale, Scott, is that Democrats who could never, ever imagine that they would ever vote Republican see Donald Trump as a long, long, long way from that Mitt Romney kind of yacht club, Republican with the blue blazer and the sporty cravat, and I rather like the cut of that man's jib. And find in Donald Trump a guy who's a lot more down to earth, who talks like they do and thinks like they do and so on. And it certainly cost Hillary the election in the so-called blue wall states, in the industrial Northwest, Midwest. And it seems to be accelerating. And it's accelerating because we used to have 1% economic growth. Now we have 4% economic growth. That means that people are no longer out of work. They're making a lot more money. There's a lot more jobs available. And furthermore, I've heard anecdotal stories from people who work in the White House about Donald Trump meeting with teams of union leaders who, 4 or 5 people, and the union guys would come out of there just stunned because the first things that again, this is a second, third person anecdotal story, but they said, first of all, Obama never invited us in here. And secondly, we never talked with anybody who understands how this thing works because they're used to dealing with politicians. Donald Trump is a businessman. Donald Trump understands things like the cost of labor. He knows how to negotiate on the part of management, which is a refreshing change from having the management negotiating on behalf of labor. And he knows how to negotiate. He doesn't just sit there, well, you can either take my crust of bread or go out there and starve in the gutter. He understands that there are things that they want. He's got things that he wants. And we're going to trade some things to see if we can find something that neither of us particularly likes, but that we can both live with. And so the working men and women of America are finding more and more and more that their lifelong affiliation with the Democratic Party is now meaning that they have to be in support of higher taxes on themselves, lower economic growth, more and more people out of work. This is what being a Democrat costs them in terms of their pocketbook. And I think more and more people are also finding out that being a Democrat now costs them, being the party of black masked thugs who burn down buildings because they don't want to hear a gay man come to campus and speak at a university. And I think they're probably getting a little enough of finding themselves to be the party of people who talk about microaggressions as if they've been, mortally wounded, when many of these people are out there working actual jobs on loading docks and in steel mills and so on. And we're not talking about microaggressions there. We're talking about 2,000 degree bolts of molten metal flying through the air. And I don't think they have a whole lot of patience for this social justice warrior thing. And here's why this is catastrophic for the Democrats, because it's not just a voting bloc, Scott. If the Democratic strategy of becoming more and more progressive and getting more and more toxic and firing up ever more smaller groups of more and more enthusiastic people, then they haven't just lost a voting bloc, and they haven't just lost the voting bloc that's going to win them elections, because black workers fall into this category as well. Donald Trump's support among black Americans has doubled or tripled, and that's the end of the Democratic Party, period. That's all there is to it. It's a separate issue. But working class people are finding themselves with money in their pockets, and they are finding themselves with jobs that they had been told by Democrats and Republicans, and people like me told them those jobs are gone forever. There's just no way. You cannot expect a company to go out of business in order to stay in America. It's not a reasonable thing to ask a business to do. If you're competing against other businesses that are based in Asia and their prices are 50% what mine have to be, then it's not unreasonable for me to go to Asia as well, because otherwise I'm out of business, and competition keeps prices low. And this is why, in conjunction with this story about the unions and so on, that I saw yesterday on Drudge that the United States is now the #1 most competitive economy in the world, and we have not been #1 for 10 years. And that would be at the election of Barack Obama, also at the time of the financial crisis, but that was largely caused by Democrats as well. So for the last decade, we've watched ourselves go from #1 to 4 to, I think we got 12 or something like that in terms of, freedom to do business. We are now the best country in the world to do business in. And I don't see this being the result of a Newt Gingrich Republican, surge in Congress. I see this as having a businessman president, and I don't think anybody is escaping this conclusion anymore.
So a good business person looks at the long term, and this is perhaps the concern. So U.S. wages are growing right now at a faster pace than they have in 9 years. This new U.S. steel deal with the United Steelworkers actually not only provides percentage increases every year for the next, I believe it was a 4 or 5 year contract, but they get a lump sum bonus and profit sharing, and they already had pretty good, in their perception, they had pretty good health benefits. However, U.S. Steel's, even though their pre-tax profit grew in the second quarter by like 60%, their stock price is down about 40% so far this year. And because of increased demand, they're having to invest a lot more in capital expenditures. And so in the long haul, this is driving up their costs at a time when steel prices appear to have peaked, and since June have actually come down about 10%. So my question is, do you see this as essentially a short-term tactic by Donald Trump to get what he wants as far as bilateral trade agreements go, or as a long-term strategy to say it's tariffs all the way down?
I don't think it's either of those. Let's deal with the tariffs, and then I want to talk about the factories and the capital costs. So don't let me forget that, please. Look, here's the way I look at tariffs, and I suspect this is similar to the way that Donald Trump looks at tariffs. We can both agree that it's better to sit in peace than to get punched in the face until your nose is bloody and you lose an eye. We can all agree that it's much nicer to sit there comfortably and deal friendly with somebody than it is to be in a life and death struggle where you're pounding each other's head against the concrete and beating each other's brains out, which is what a tariff war really is. So we're all in agreement that that would be a much better world to live in than the world where everybody's just beating each other up all the time. But if you live in a world where one person is punching you in the face and they keep punching you in the face and you don't do anything about it, guess what's going to happen? Not only are they going to keep punching you in the face, they're going to punch you harder and harder and harder in the face because, number one, it's to their advantage the weaker you become. And number two, they want to find out where that limit is. They have nothing but contempt. This is what bullies, this is why fighting back at bullies is so important. It's not important that you inflict physical pain on the bully. It's not important that you land a blow. It's not important that you hit the guy so they don't want to mess with him anymore. That's not how it works. Simply by fighting back, you have earned respect from this guy who is walking around looking for weakness. He's programmed to do that. And so when you get into tariffs, what you're really saying is, okay, well, we've been punched in the face for 10 years now. So there's one for you. How's it feel? Not so good, huh? Now what do you want to do? And now I'm sure it's going to escalate. I'm sure there's going to be a brawl. But when there's a brawl, Scott, both sides have something to lose now. And both sides have a reason to go back to sitting like human beings and being civilized. When one side's doing all the punching and the other side's doing all the taking, it's an endless cycle of abuse, and we deserve the abuse and we deserve the scorn that we get. So I look at tariffs as primarily as a means of saying you're going to have to play fair. You're not going to be able to steal all our stuff anymore. We're not going to put up with it anymore. We're going to hit you where you live. Everybody talks about how weak America's economy is and how strong China's is, but they got this enormous debt. And if we cut the sales to China, if we cut their revenues because of tariffs, then not only do we get jobs back in America, but then China is actually, they got something to worry about. So that's the tariff argument. The modernization argument is a very, very good argument. Hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it. But I think it probably works something like this. U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, all of these amazing American companies really came to their absolute prominence in the late 30s, mostly in the 40s as a result of World War II, 40s, 50s, and 60s. We were the steel producers of the world because we were making things. We were making cars. We were making everything in the whole wide world. And then somewhere around the 70s or the 80s, the Japanese started to take over not only with steel production, but auto production. And one of the reasons the Japanese took over was because they were making better products at a lower price, and that'll do it. And the reason they're making better products at a lower price, Scott, was because all of the factories in Japan were built in probably the 50s or 60s. And maybe even the 70s, while the factories in America were built in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So the Japanese had to invest, since their entire economy had been wiped out. The Japanese had to invest in a steel industry, but at the time they were making those investments, so much technological progress has occurred that they're simply far more efficient than our steel mills were, and that's why they basically practically put us out of business. Now, if we are living in a time of economic growth and 4% growth and money is available, and steel companies have to spend a big part of that money on getting a modern factory going, then that is the leapfrog over the frog. That is American factories built in the 30s being beaten by Japanese factories built in the 70s, being beaten by American factories built in the 2020s. And this is nothing but good. I suspect that after the beating that the manufacturing industry's taken in the last 30 or 40 years, I suspect it's gotten pretty clear to them that they are, if they're going to bring manufacturing back to the United States, they are going to have to invest large sums of money in being as efficient as possible, because Americans are great workers. They're just terrific workers. They can't compete with Chinese wages, and they shouldn't compete with Chinese wages. So the only way we have to compete with those Asian wages is cheaper energy. That's very, very important. And a far higher sense of efficiency. And it looks like both of those things are coming to the table, and they're both coming to the table because of Cheeto Hitler, who, who's bringing this Holocaust to America. He's not bringing a Holocaust to America. He's not bringing the destruction of America. He's bringing the destruction of progressives, and that's why progressives can't stand him.
And a lower tax rate and less regulation doesn't hurt that process
Doesn't
either.
hurt at all.
Bill Whittle Now brings you Bill's hot takes 5 days a week on the breaking news of the day. It's made entirely possible by members at BillWhittle.com who contribute $9.95 a month to get some content that the average person can't get. But that's not what they tell us they do it for. They tell us they do it because they want to spread that content around the world. The most common complaint we get at BillWhittle.com is from members saying, why are you keeping this members-only content behind the paywalls? Get it out there. We are grateful for that. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.